The room was warm with celebration, soft music glasses, catching light, the low comfort of family gathered for something good. I stood there with my fiancé's hand in mine, steadying my breath, believing this was a safe moment to say it out loud. That we were engaged, that we were ready. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You should postpone the wedding," he said, calm as weather. "Leo needs the money more." Before I could speak, my mother added just as evenly, "Your wedding fund was already used. For your brother." The room didn't protest. No gasps, no confusion. The silence landed clean and final, like a decision everyone else had already signed. In that quiet, I understood what this really was. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding. A plan carried out over time, waiting for the moment it would hurt least to say aloud. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt offered up. If you're listening right now, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if this story finds you, if it echoes something you recognize, stay with me. A like and a quiet subscribe help more than you know. When I look back, the imbalance didn't begin at that engagement party. It had been there long before anyone trusted me with adult words for it. It lived in the quiet adjustments my parents made, the small accommodations that always seemed reasonable when explained out loud. Leo needed more patience. Leo needed more time. Leo was going through something. I learned early that my role was to make things easier by not needing much at all. We grew up in the same house, ate at the same table, slept under the same roof. From the outside, there was no obvious cruelty. No shouting matches or slammed doors. What there was instead was a steady calibration of expectations. I was the older one, the responsible one, the one who didn't need reminders. When teachers praised me, my parents nodded, as if confirming a forecast. When Leo struggled, they leaned in, voices softening, ready with explanations and second chances. I started working as soon as I was legally allowed. Not because I was told to, but because it felt assumed. Money meant independence, and independence meant fewer complications for everyone else. Leo, on the other hand, moved through jobs like they were temporary shelters. If one didn't work out, there was always a reason: bad management, bad timing, bad luck. None of it stuck to him the way effort stuck to me. Birthdays made the difference visible in ways I couldn't unsee. My gifts were practical. Books, clothes I needed anyway. Things that suggested preparation for the future. Leo's were indulgent electronics upgrades, experiences meant to soften disappointment. When I asked once carefully if it was fair, my mother smiled and said, fairness didn't always look the same. My father added that I understood how the world worked. Leo was still learning. That explanation followed me everywhere. When it came time for college, I planned with spreadsheets and late nights. Scholarships, part-time work, loans I would manage myself. Leo changed majors twice and took a break he never quite returned from. Each time he faltered, the family rearranged itself to cushion the fall. I watched from the edge, telling myself that being low maintenance was a virtue, that my steadiness gave them room to help him, that this was how families functioned. What I didn't realize then was how thoroughly that idea would shape my silence. Every achievement I reached felt strangely muted. Promotions were acknowledged with brief congratulations before the conversation drifted back to Leo's latest plan. My progress didn't register as momentum. It registered as proof that I would be fine without much attention. When I moved out, paid my own bills, and built routines that didn't require supervision, it was treated as a relief rather than a milestone. I learned to measure my words, to edit questions before they left my mouth. If I raised a concern, it was reframed as unnecessary tension. If I expressed frustration, it became an overreaction. The message was consistent harmony, depended on my restraint. There were moments I almost spoke up. Small flashes of anger that surprised me with their intensity. But each time I swallowed them back down, telling myself it wasn't worth disrupting the balance. I convinced myself that love didn't need to be equal to be real. That being dependable was its own reward. That one day when it mattered, the scales would even out. By the time I was in my 20s, the pattern felt permanent. I didn't resent Leo, not exactly. I resented the gravity that pulled everything toward him. The way his instability required constant attention while my stability rendered me invisible. I told myself I was choosing peace, that I was mature enough to let things go. But letting things go came at a cost. It meant accepting that my needs would always arrive second, if they arrived at all. It meant understanding that success in my family wasn't something to be supported, it was something to be relied upon. Looking back now, I can see how thoroughly that conditioning prepared me for what came later. How easy it was for my parents to assume I would adapt, to sacrifice, to absorb the loss quietly and move on. They had watched me do it my entire life, and I let them believe I always would. The wedding fund was introduced like a correction. Not an apology, nothing in my family ever arrived dressed as one, but a gesture meant to close a long-running imbalance without naming it. I was 22, freshly out of school, still learning how to live without measuring myself against anyone else. One evening, my parents called us into the living room and spoke with the careful tone they used when they wanted something to sound final. They said they had been thinking about the future, about fairness, about how they wanted to do things right this time. 2 accounts, they explained. One for me, one for Leo. Equal amounts, clearly labeled. The purpose was specific: a wedding or a first home. Something foundational. Something that would mark the start of our adult lives. My father leaned back in his chair and said almost proudly that after this, no one would owe anyone anything. Clean lines. No resentment. No confusion. I remember the feeling that moved through me then. It wasn't joy exactly. It was relief. The kind that settles into your shoulders when you realize you've been holding tension for years without noticing. I didn't ask for details. I didn't request statements or access. I didn't even ask when the money would be available. The promise itself felt like enough. For the first time, it seemed like my parents were acknowledging something they had never said out loud. That I had been dependable to a fault. That my quiet competence had been convenient. That fairness had been postponed, not denied. And now finally it was being addressed. I took them at their word. From that point on, the fund became a fixed point in my mind. Not something I planned around day to day, but something that existed in the background, stable and untouched. A marker that said I was allowed to build without fear of sudden imbalance. It softened old edges. When Leo needed help again, another loan, another chance, I reminded myself that boundaries had been drawn. That whatever else happened there was one thing that couldn't be taken. I didn't monitor it because monitoring felt like mistrust. And mistrust felt like an accusation. I wanted to believe that this was the moment my parents had chosen to be deliberate. That they had learned something from years of watching us diverge. So I left the accounts alone, untouched by suspicion. As the years passed, I folded that belief into my sense of self. I worked harder, saved more, invested carefully. I didn't ask my parents for money even when it would have helped. The fund was not a safety net. It was a symbol, proof that at least in one area I had been seen. Occasionally, my mother would mention it in passing. A comment about when you get married someday, or if you decide to buy a house. Each time it reinforced the idea that the money was still there, waiting for its intended moment. I never heard the same reassurance extended to Leo, but I didn't dwell on that. I told myself it wasn't my business, that equality didn't require constant reminders. Looking back, I can see how much trust I invested in that silence. There were moments when doubt tried to surface. A casual remark about helping Leo through a rough patch. A vague comment about family finances being fluid. Each time I pushed the thought away. My parents had made a point of separating the funds. They had used the language of fairness deliberately. Surely that meant something. I didn't consider that promises in my family were often conditional. That clarity was offered only when it served a purpose. That boundaries existed until they became inconvenient. At 25, then 26, then 27, the fund remained an unexamined certainty. I never imagined it could be altered without my knowledge. The idea felt too brazen, too openly unjust. Even for my family, that seemed like a line they wouldn't cross. What I didn't understand then was how easily certainty can be used against you. How trust becomes a kind of permission. By believing the fund was secure, I stopped asking questions. By accepting the language of equality, I stopped checking whether it was being practiced. The wedding fund wasn't just money. It was the one place where I believed my parents had finally chosen balance over convenience. That belief shaped my decisions in ways I didn't recognize at the time. It kept me compliant. It kept me hopeful. It kept me quiet. And in that quiet, something irreversible was already happening without my consent, without my knowledge, and without any intention of ever telling me. Adulthood arrived for me, without ceremony. No safety net, no dramatic leap, just a steady accumulation of responsibility that felt familiar. I built a career in tech the way I had built everything else, quietly, deliberately, without asking anyone to clear space for me. I learned which risks were worth taking and which ones I couldn't afford. I saved more than I spent. I planned further ahead than most people my age. Stability wasn't a goal, it was a reflex. I didn't lean on my parents, not financially, not emotionally. When I needed advice, I sought it elsewhere. When I needed reassurance, I learned to supply it myself. Independence had become my default setting, honed over years of being the one who didn't require monitoring. I told myself this was strength, and in many ways, it was. I met my future wife during that period, after I had already learned how to stand on my own. The relationship didn't feel like rescue or escape. It felt balanced. We talked openly about money expectations timelines. We disagreed without destabilizing each other. When we imagined a future together, it wasn't built on assumptions. It was built on plans we were both willing to carry. That mattered to me more than I admitted at the time. While my life settled into something solid, Leo's remained unsettled. Business ideas came and went. Each one was framed as a breakthrough, then quietly abandoned when it failed to materialize. Credit card balances grew. Jobs ended with explanations that shifted depending on the audience. None of it surprised me anymore. What did surprise me was how seamlessly my parents continued to intervene. There was always a rationale. Helping Leo through a transition, giving him time to reset, protecting his confidence. The language softened every consequence, turning instability into something temporary and forgivable. I listened without comment, reminding myself that boundaries existed now. that the wedding fund marked a line that couldn't be crossed. Still, the requests for understanding became more frequent. "You're doing well," my mother would say. "You don't need help the way he does," my father added. I heard those sentences so often they began to sound like facts rather than justifications. Each time I nodded, each time I told myself that compassion didn't cost me anything, that I could afford to be generous with patience, that my life wasn't diminished by someone else's needs. But something subtle shifted during those years. A quiet expectation formed, unspoken but persistent. That I would always adapt. That I would absorb inconvenience because I was capable of it. My success became the reason I was expected to make room. When I talked about long-term plans, buying a home, starting a family, my parents listened politely, then redirected the conversation. There was no discouragement exactly, just an absence of engagement, as if my future was already accounted for, already stable enough not to require their attention. Leo's setbacks, on the other hand, were treated as emergencies. They demanded immediate focus, immediate resources, immediate concern. The contrast wasn't dramatic. It was normalized. That was what made it effective. No one ever said my needs mattered less. They simply acted as if they did. I didn't challenge it. I had learned long ago that challenging the structure only created friction without resolution. So I continued forward, building a life that functioned without approval. I told myself that when the time came, when I finally asked for something tangible, the response would be different. That belief followed me into my engagement. By the time I proposed, I had already mapped out the logistics. We knew what we could afford on our own. We had agreed to keep things reasonable, intentional. The wedding fund wasn't a crutch. It was a contribution that allowed us to plan without anxiety. It represented support, not dependence. When I told my parents we were engaged, their smiles arrived on cue. Congratulations were offered. Hugs were exchanged. But there was a hollowness beneath the surface that I couldn't quite name. No questions about dates. No excitement about venues. The details, normally the currency of family involvement, were avoided. When I mentioned the wedding fund, the response shifted. My mother said we could talk about it later. My father changed the subject. The deflection was smooth enough that I almost missed it. Almost. Leo's reaction was different. He didn't congratulate us at all. He leaned back, arms crossed, and said something that sounded like a joke, until it didn't. That getting married right now seemed inconvenient. Selfish, even. The word stayed with me longer than it should have. That was the first time I allowed myself to wonder whether the stability I had built was being counted against me. Whether my parents saw my life as flexible simply because I had made it resilient. Whether the support I believed was waiting for me had already been reassigned. I didn't know yet how close I was to the truth. But the ground had started to shift. And for the first time in years, I felt the faint, unsettling sense that something essential had been decided without me. After the engagement, I tried to move forward the way I always had, methodically, without urgency, assuming the pieces would fall into place once we addressed them directly. We didn't rush the wedding. We talked through timelines, guest lists, what mattered and what didn't. It felt grounded, adult. The kind of planning that comes from choosing each other without theatrics. My parents, however, stayed oddly distant from the process. They asked polite questions when prompted, but never followed up. When I mentioned dates, they nodded. When I talked about venues, they offered neutral opinions that led nowhere. It wasn't disapproval. It was absence. The kind that leaves you unsure whether you're welcome to expect anything at all. Eventually, I asked about the wedding fund directly, not accusatory, not demanding, just a question framed as logistics. My mother's response was brief and non-committal. She said we would figure it out later, that there was no rush. My father echoed her, adding that things were a little complicated right now. Complicated how I wondered. But I didn't press. I had spent a lifetime learning when to pause. Around that same time, Leo's behavior shifted. He grew quieter in group settings, less performative. When he did speak, it carried an edge I hadn't heard before. Comments disguised as humor, observations framed as concern. He suggested that maybe now wasn't the best moment for me to be focusing on a wedding, that there were other priorities the family had to consider. I asked him what he meant. He shrugged, said I knew what he meant. That ambiguity unsettled me more than an argument would have. It suggested knowledge I didn't have access to, a conversation I wasn't part of. The feeling followed me home. I replayed small interactions looking for context I might have missed. The way my parents avoided eye contact when finances came up. The way my mother changed the subject when I mentioned deposits. The way Leo watched me, not with jealousy, but with something closer to expectation. I told myself I was overthinking it. That stress had a way of inventing problems where none existed. I reminded myself that the fund was real, that it had been promised clearly, that it had never been framed as conditional. There was no logical reason to believe it had been touched. Still, when the time came to secure a venue, I hesitated. Deposits required numbers, not assurances. I decided it was reasonable to request access to the account not because I doubted it was there, but because clarity would simplify everything. I wanted to move forward without carrying this low-grade uncertainty with me. The bank call was uneventful. Routine questions, identity verification, the kind of administrative friction that makes you glance at the clock. When the representative finally pulled up the account, there was a pause. Not long, just long enough to register. She cleared her throat and read the balance. 0. At first, I assumed I had misunderstood, that I had accessed the wrong account, that there had been a delay in processing. I asked her to confirm. She did. Then she added gently that the withdrawals had been made over time, not recently, not all at once. A series of transfers spanning more than 2 years. I ended the call without saying much, sat still longer than necessary. The room felt quiet in a way that pressed inward. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't anything yet. My mind kept circling the same thought: there must be an explanation. When I confronted my parents, they didn't deny it. There was no scramble, no surprise. Just a shared glance before my mother spoke. She said they had meant to tell me that it had been a difficult decision, that circumstances had changed. The money, they explained, had gone toward Leo, paying down debt, funding another attempt at stability, helping him get back on his feet. They spoke as if they were listing household repairs, necessary, practical, unavoidable. I asked about his fund. My father hesitated before answering. Said it was untouched, that they didn't want to discourage him by taking away his safety net. The words landed slowly, each one settling into place, with brutal clarity. My fund, the one designated for my future, had been drained quietly, incrementally, without my knowledge. Leo's had been preserved. I felt something in me go still. Not shock, not rage, recognition. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was a continuation. The same logic that had governed my childhood now applied to my adulthood. I had been stable, so my resources were flexible. He had been fragile, so his were protected. The realization was heavier than anger. It meant this had never been an exception. It was policy. The conversation that followed didn't feel like a confrontation. It felt like a briefing information delivered after the outcome was already secured. My parents spoke carefully not to explain themselves, but to contain the damage. They chose their words the way people do when they believe resistance is temporary. They told me the withdrawals hadn't been reckless, that the money had been moved gradually responsibly as Leo's needs arose. A credit card here, a loan there, an opportunity that required one last push. Each transfer had been justified in isolation, each decision framed as temporary. Together they had emptied an account that was never supposed to be touched. I asked why I hadn't been told. My mother said she didn't want to worry me. My father said they assumed I would understand. The phrase hung between us familiar and unexamined. You'll understand. You always do. I asked why they hadn't used Leo's fund instead. There was a pause this time, longer, heavier. My father said they didn't want to take away his chance to start fresh. My mother added that Leo needed to know someone believed in him. I waited for the rest, for the acknowledgement that my chance had been taken instead. It didn't come. What did come was justification, the kind that arrives dressed as logic. They reminded me that the money had come from them, that it was never legally mine, that circumstances change, that families adjust. My mother said I was doing well. My father said I had options. They spoke as if those facts negated the promise entirely. When I said the fund had been designated clearly for a purpose, my mother's voice sharpened. She accused me of fixating on money, of missing the bigger picture. She asked if I really wanted to tear the family apart over finances. The accusation landed where it was meant to, not as a question, but as a warning. Leo sat there through most of it silent. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look grateful either. He looked resigned, as if this arrangement had been inevitable. When I finally turned to him and asked if he knew, he nodded. He said he hadn't asked for it, that our parents had offered, that he hadn't thought I would mind. I didn't respond right away. I was still absorbing the shape of what had happened. The fact that this hadn't been an emergency, it had been a slow reallocation of resources away from me, carried out with confidence that I would adapt. When I said it wasn't okay, the temperature shifted. My mother accused me of being dramatic. My father said I was overreacting. They reminded me again that I was strong, that I had built a life without their help, that this situation only proved I didn't need the money the way Leo did. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. My strength had become evidence against me. Every boundary I had respected, every burden I had absorbed. Every time I had chosen not to ask for help, it had all been quietly tallied and used to justify taking more. I told them I felt erased. My mother scoffed. She said I was making it personal, that they were doing what parents do, protecting their children. I wanted to ask which child she meant, but the question felt unnecessary. The answer had been clear for years. The conversation circled itself, repeating the same points in different language. Money wasn't the issue. Family was. Sacrifice was expected. Harmony required compromise. The logic was airtight because it relied on one assumption that I would eventually concede. When I didn't, my mother's tone hardened. She said I was jeopardizing relationships over something that couldn't be changed. My father said it was done, that revisiting it would only cause pain, that it was time to move forward. Move forward meant accept it, absorb it, continue as before. I realized then that they weren't just refusing to return the money. They were refusing to acknowledge the harm, refusing to name the imbalance, refusing to grant me the right to be angry. That was the moment something in me shifted, not explosively, but decisively. I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. I stopped trying to be understood by people who had already decided I was wrong. I told them I needed time. They nodded relieved, mistaking my quiet for compliance. What they didn't understand was that this silence wasn't endurance. It was distance forming, a recalibration I should have made years earlier. I left their house that night with the clarity that comes when denial finally collapses. The fund hadn't been taken by accident. It had been reassigned by design. And the expectation that I would accept it wasn't incidental, it was foundational. For the first time, I didn't feel obligated to protect the system that had cost me so much. In the days that followed, my parents acted as if the conversation had resolved something. They called to check in, asked neutral questions about work, spoke carefully around the subject of the wedding. It was as though naming the truth had in their minds neutralized it. The money was gone. The explanation had been delivered. What remained, they seemed to believe, was my adjustment. I didn't raise my voice again. I didn't send long messages outlining what they had done. I had learned that language only gave them more surface area to deflect. Instead, I listened. I paid attention to what was repeated and what was avoided. The pattern clarified itself with every exchange. When I asked once if there was any intention to repay the money, my father said it wasn't realistic. My mother said it wouldn't be healthy to dwell on it. The fund was reframed as a closed chapter, something childish to cling to. When I reminded them it had been designated for my future, my mother accused me of weaponizing the past. Leo remained mostly absent. When he did reach out, it was brief and careful. He said he was sorry things had turned out this way, that he hoped we could move on. He never said thank you. He never offered to make it right. The distance between us wasn't hostility. It was entitlement so normalized, it didn't require defense. I began to notice how quickly the narrative shifted whenever I held my ground. If I expressed hurt, I was told I was being emotional. If I stated facts, I was accused of being cold. If I asked for accountability, I was labeled divisive. The terms changed, but the goal remained the same: reposition me as the problem. My mother said families make sacrifices. I asked who had been sacrificed. She didn't answer. My father said this wasn't about fairness, it was about survival. I asked whose. He told me I was missing the point. Each conversation followed the same arc. They spoke from a place of assumed authority. I responded from a place of lived consequence. And each time they retreated behind the same conclusion: this was over. Accept it. What struck me most was not their refusal to repay the money, but their refusal to recognize the impact. There was no acknowledgement that a boundary had been crossed. No admission that trust had been violated. They spoke as if their intentions alone absolved them of responsibility. I realized then that what they were offering wasn't reconciliation. It was compliance. The gaslighting wasn't overt. It was subtle practice built from years of repetition. They didn't deny the facts. They denied their significance. They reduced a breach of trust into a misunderstanding. They framed my response as disproportionate. The effect was cumulative. It made me question not what had happened, but whether I was allowed to react to it at all. I started writing things down, not to send, but to see clearly. Dates, statements, what was said versus what was implied. The act of recording grounded me. It reminded me that my memory was intact. that my reactions were proportional, that the confusion I felt had been cultivated, not imagined. The more I withdrew, the more pressure mounted. Extended family began reaching out, not to ask what had happened, but to urge reconciliation, to remind me how hard my parents had worked, to caution me against holding grudges. No one asked about the fund. No one asked why I hadn't been told. The assumption was unanimous. I would eventually yield. I responded to one message with a brief explanation, just the facts. The reaction was immediate and telling. The tone shifted from persuasion to discomfort. No one argued with the details. They simply stopped engaging with them. The conversation returned to platitudes, forgiveness, unity, letting go. It became clear that the truth itself was inconvenient. Not because it was unclear, but because it disrupted the narrative everyone was invested in maintaining. The idea that my parents had acted decisively, even if imperfectly, was easier to accept, and then the idea that they had exploited my reliability. I thought often about the wedding, about what it would mean to stand at the altar with this unresolved, to invite people who believed my silence was consent, to celebrate a beginning while carrying the weight of an unacknowledged loss. The question stopped being whether my parents would change. It became whether I would continue to contort myself, to preserve a version of family that had never protected me. When I finally spoke again, it wasn't to argue. It was to draw a line. I told them I couldn't move forward as if nothing had happened, that the absence of accountability mattered more than the money itself, that I needed space. My mother accused me of abandonment. My father said I was making a mistake I'd regret. Leo said nothing. I didn't defend my decision. I didn't justify it. I simply repeated it. For the first time, the silence that followed wasn't mine to manage. I didn't intend for the boundary to become an ultimatum. That wasn't my goal. I'd spent too long avoiding sharp edges to suddenly start issuing threats. But clarity has a way of tightening choices, and once I said I needed space, the reality of what that meant settled in quickly. I told my parents there were only two paths forward. Either the money would be repaid, acknowledged, accounted for, treated as something that had been taken without consent, or I would step back entirely. Not temporarily, not symbolically, completely. I wasn't asking for interest. I wasn't asking for punishment. I was asking for recognition. The response came without hesitation. My father said repayment wasn't possible. My mother said it wouldn't be fair to Leo. They spoke as if the matter were already closed, as if my request was an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. When I pressed only once, my mother's voice hardened. She said if I chose to get married without them, that would be my decision. The implication was clear absence would be my fault. The sentence did something to me. It removed the last illusion that this was a misunderstanding. They weren't negotiating. They were issuing terms. I stopped trying to explain myself. There was nothing left to clarify. The line had been drawn, and they had chosen their side. In the days that followed, I made decisions that felt both surreal and inevitable. I contacted the venue and adjusted the guest list. I canceled accommodations that had been reserved out of habit rather than necessity. I drafted messages I never sent. Each small action carried the weight of finality. This wasn't a pause. It was a separation. I returned the spare key to my parents' house without ceremony, slipped it into an envelope. No note, no accusation. Just the object itself stripped of symbolism. I blocked numbers not out of anger, but to protect the fragile clarity I had fought to reach. I needed quiet to think, to grieve something I had only just admitted I was losing. Word traveled faster than I expected. Extended family reached out in waves, some confused, some indignant, some concerned. Most framed their messages around reconciliation. A few hinted that I was being ungrateful, that parents make mistakes, that blood should outweigh money. None asked what it felt like to discover that a promise you built your future around had been quietly dismantled. I wrote one email, just one. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't accusatory. It laid out the timeline, the facts, the conversations that had taken place. It explained the decision without asking for approval. I sent it to everyone who had contacted me with advice they weren't prepared to inform themselves about. The silence that followed was instructive. Some people stopped reaching out entirely. Others responded with brief acknowledgments, carefully avoiding the substance. A few apologized, not for what had happened, but for not knowing. No one challenged the facts. The pressure didn't vanish, but it lost its confidence. The narrative had cracked. The wedding plans moved forward smaller and simpler than originally imagined. We adjusted expectations without resentment. There was relief in planning something that reflected our actual resources, rather than a promise that no longer existed. Each decision felt earned. My parents didn't reach out again during that period. When they did, it was indirect. A message passed through a relative. An update framed as concern. Still no apology. Still no mention of the money. Just an unspoken request that I reverse course quietly. I didn't respond. What surprised me most wasn't the loss of contact. It was the absence of guilt. I had expected it to arrive heavy and immediate, the way it always had when I disrupted the family equilibrium. Instead, there was a steadiness I hadn't felt before. A sense that something had finally aligned. I realized then how much of my emotional energy had been spent managing other people's comfort. How often I had adjusted my reactions to make room for their explanations. Stepping back wasn't cruelty. It was accuracy. The night before we finalized the guest list, I sat alone and considered what it would mean to walk into my marriage without my parents present. The image was stark. It carried sadness, yes, but not devastation. The grief was specific, bounded. It didn't spill into everything else. That was how I knew the decision was right. I wasn't cutting ties to punish anyone. I was refusing to participate in a dynamic that required my silence to function. The absence wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of self-respect. By the time the invitations went out, the shape of my life had changed. Not dramatically, quietly, the way it always had. Only this time, the adjustment was mine. The wedding day arrived without spectacle. No grand entrances, no carefully staged reunions. Just a clear morning, a small gathering, and a calm I hadn't expected to feel so fully. The venue was modest, chosen for its light rather than its prestige. It suited us. Everything about the day reflected intention rather than obligation. There were empty seats in the front row. I noticed them, of course. Not with shock, but with recognition. Their absence wasn't a wound reopening, it was a confirmation. A visible marker of a decision already made. I didn't scan the room hoping they might appear at the last moment. That hope had been set down weeks earlier. As the ceremony began, I realized something had shifted inside me. I wasn't bracing for disappointment. I wasn't rehearsing explanations in my head. I was present, fully. The weight I had carried for years, the need to be agreeable, to manage expectations, to soften truths, wasn't there. Friends stood in roles my family once assumed they would fill. My wife's parents welcomed me without reservation, without conditions. They didn't try to replace anything. They simply showed up. That was enough. When I spoke my vows, I felt the clarity of what I was committing to. Not just a person, but a way of living that didn't require self-erasure. I wasn't entering marriage hoping it would stabilize something broken. I was entering it already whole. There was no dramatic moment of grief, no surge of anger. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something important was missing, and that I was allowed to continue anyway. That absence didn't define the day. It contextualized it. After the ceremony, people hugged us, laughed with us, asked how we felt. No one asked where my parents were. The question hovered unspoken, then dissolved. It didn't need an answer. The day had its own gravity. Later during the reception, I caught myself smiling without calculation. Not the polite kind I'd perfected over years, but something easier. Something unguarded. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't anticipating criticism or commentary. The quiet was clean. At one point, a friend raised a glass and said something simple about chosen family. It wasn't meant as a statement. It was an observation. It landed gently without accusation or sentimentality. I felt it settle into place. I thought briefly of my parents then, not with longing, but with distance. I wondered what story they were telling themselves that day, whether they framed their absence as restraint or righteousness, whether they believed I would eventually reach out. The thought passed. The truth was I had already grieved the version of family I wished I had. I had done it slowly in fragments over years of quiet accommodation. The wedding didn't create a loss. It marked the end of pretending it hadn't already occurred. As the evening wound down, I stood with my wife and watched people gather their things. There was warmth in the room, a sense of completion, not the kind that closes a chapter neatly, but the kind that allows you to move forward without dragging the past behind you. I realized then that I wasn't carrying resentment into my marriage. I wasn't carrying unfinished arguments or unmet expectations. I was carrying clarity, and that felt like a gift I had given myself. When the night ended, we left without fanfare. No extended goodbyes, no second guessing. Just the understanding that the life we were building would be defined by presence, not obligation. Driving away, I thought about how long I had waited for approval that never came, how much energy I had spent trying to earn fairness. The realization didn't hurt the way it once would have. It felt like an old story I no longer needed to retell. I entered my marriage without my parents beside me. But I didn't enter it alone, and for the first time that distinction mattered. Time didn't bring reconciliation. It brought clarity. In the months after the wedding, life settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar in its simplicity. There were no sudden emergencies, no urgent calls demanding emotional triage. Mornings were quiet. Decisions were made without consulting a committee. The absence I had once feared became space to notice how little drama my life required when I stopped accommodating it. Leo's trajectory didn't change. The business venture he had funded with my wedding money collapsed quietly without headlines or explanations. There was no reinvention, no redemption arc, just another plan that failed to hold. This time, there was no untouched fund waiting in reserve, no account to draw from without consequence. The silence around his struggles grew heavier, less defensible. My parents reached out sporadically, not directly at first. Messages filtered through relatives, updates framed as concern, invitations phrased as opportunities to put everything behind us. There were no apologies, no acknowledgement of what had been taken, no curiosity about how I had experienced any of it. The assumption was that enough time had passed for me to soften. When they finally contacted me themselves, The tone was cautious. My mother asked how I was doing, as if we were resuming a conversation, paused mid-sentence. My father said they missed me. Neither mentioned the fund. Neither asked what it would take to rebuild trust. They spoke as though proximity alone could erase history. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, I told them I wasn't ready to reconnect, that nothing had changed, that accountability mattered. The line went quiet. My mother sighed. My father said he hoped I would reconsider. The call ended without resolution. I didn't feel shaken afterward. There was sadness, yes, but it was clean. It didn't spiral. It didn't reopen old negotiations in my head. I had already made peace with the reality that my parents' version of family required my silence. I wasn't willing to pay that price anymore. What surprised me most was how consistently my boundaries held. I didn't have to reinforce them with anger or explanation. I simply maintained them. The world didn't collapse. Relationships adjusted. Some people drifted away. Others stayed respecting the shape of my life as it now existed. I thought often about the word family and how easily it's used to justify harm. How quickly obligation replaces consent. How often sacrifice is demanded from the person least likely to refuse. For years I had confused endurance with virtue. I had believed that being needed meant being valued. I know better now. Family, I've learned, isn't defined by who feels entitled to your resources, emotional or otherwise. It's defined by who recognizes your limits without challenging them, who honors your autonomy even when it inconveniences them, who doesn't require you to disappear in order to belong. The absence of my parents didn't leave a void the way I once imagined it would. It left a boundary clear, protective, necessary. Within that boundary, my life expanded, not dramatically, steadily, the way things grow when they're finally given the right conditions. I don't hate my parents. I don't seek retribution. I don't need them to understand me in order to move forward. I needed to understand myself. To see that being sacrificed for someone else's comfort was not an act of love, it was a failure of responsibility. There are moments when grief surfaces unexpectedly. A holiday, a memory, a photo I didn't know existed. I let those moments pass without assigning the meaning beyond what they are. Loss doesn't require justification. It doesn't require resolution. It only requires honesty. I am honest now about what I can and cannot accept, about the cost of access to my life, about the boundaries that keep it livable. If there's a lesson in all of this, it isn't about money. It's about permission. The permission we give others to rewrite our needs as excess, to frame our stability as surplus, to decide quietly that we can afford to lose more. You can't build a life on that foundation. Eventually, something collapses. Walking away didn't make me colder. It made me precise. It taught me that love without respect is not love, it's expectation. An expectation left unexamined becomes entitlement. I didn't lose my family. I lost a role I was never meant to keep playing. And in letting it go, I found something quieter, sturdier, and far more sustainable peace. There's a moment many of us reach often later than we should when we realize that being the strong one comes with an unspoken cost. Strength invites assumption, silence invites extraction. And love, when paired with obligation, can slowly hollow you out. What saved me wasn't confrontation. It was clarity. The willingness to see patterns for what they were, not what I hoped they'd become. Choosing boundaries didn't fix my family, but it fixed something more important, my relationship with myself. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been expected to sacrifice quietly so others could stay comfortable, I'd like to hear from you. Share where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your stories matter even when they're hard to tell. Thank you for staying with me through this. A like and a subscribe help keep these stories alive, and I'm genuinely grateful for both.